Okay, we're recording. Um, Hi Shank, thank you for meeting for the second podcast.
No worries.
No worries, thank you. So this podcast is gonna be a little bit more focused on the concept of activism. And are you familiar with Fred Kuwornu?
No.
So Fred is an Italian Ghanaian filmmaker and activist. His work explores multiculturalism in Italy. He spotlights themes of racism and the experiences of minorities in Italy. So
Inter-
the concept of activism, well, in one of my classes, we discussed that activism is kind of loose because it kind of means advocating for a cause which is greater, alluding to issues greater than oneself. This includes the representation of minority cultures, LGBTQ, and environmental justice. Can you share some specific examples of forms of activism in works that you have studied in Rome?
I think going off your definition of what activism is, the first thing that I thought of was um basically like when I got into Rome, when I got into AUR, the school that I attended, I had an FYS class, which is like a liberal thing class, but it's a foundation for a lot of courses. And we discussed the immigrant experience, so like nation and migration. Those are kind of theme or topic for that class. And then one of my last classes that I took in Rome was intercultural communications. And the two classes that I mentioned, one thing that was similar was we both tackled a book titled Clash of Civilizations over an elevator in Piazza Vittorio by Amara Lacus. And basically this book talks about stereotypes of minorities in Rome, and it's satire. I'd say it's a satire book. I'd recommend it, but it shapes the story kind of around a single apartment in Piazza Vittorio, which is an immigrant area in Rome, and the residents within the building. They're basically each chapter of like the book is a different resident telling their story because it shapes around like a murder in that building, and one of the residents was is the murderer. And these residents in the building, their stories don't really intertwine, but more of like crossover with each other. So intersectionality. And it basically reveals this microcosm of modern Rome. And I basically explored this through like intersectionality and multiculturalism. And I can pull up the essay that I wrote, and I think my conclusion paragraph is correlated like or relates to the question that you asked me. So I wrote as my conclusion. In conclusion, Class of Civilizations over an elevator in Piazza Vittorio presents a series of conflicting, casually bigoted, and often very funny monologues, but still somewhat accentuates the importance of multiculturalism. However, Lecousse kindly gazes in his book. Perhaps is his way of noting that battling outsiders have defined Italy since the beginning of time, and those clashes made Italy Italian. Lastly, Clash of Civilizations is a fascinating exploration of the inconsistency of perspective. Because of multiple narrators, this book can be perceived as a love letter to Rome, but also a sharp criticism of it. And when I say sharp criticism, it's more of like these stereotypes that are embedded within the minority groups within the city.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So earlier I was talking a little bit about Fred and how he uses his films to address issues of race and identity in Italy. How do you
Mhm.
incorporate issues of race and identity into your creative works, um, and the works that you plan to make in the future?
Uh, I wouldn't essentially say I think of my films as a form of activism. It's definitely more creative, and I definitely think obviously both of them can coexist, but I don't do that intentionally. And I think the reason I don't do that and I don't tackle themes of race and identity is because me and you, we're people of color, we're Asian. So, it doesn't really matter, I think, like, especially in a bigger sense. Like, yes, we are trying to change this, but like, what I have to say won't be as important as what the white person would say.
Yeah.
Like, the society as a whole would probably be more likely to believe that white person than to believe me because I'm Asian and I'm Moreno and all of that. So,
Yeah.
my creative works reflect things that I'm interested in and obviously showcase parts of my identities and cultures, but very subconsciously. And my film tends to encapsulate the raw, authentic moments of my life. So, it's possible that these issues can probably be birthed some way or another, but they exist in my films as a reflection of how they exist in my real life or my experiences, I guess.
Yeah, very interesting takes. Um, okay, so in terms about the impact on communities, what impact did your work in Rome have on the international community and the broader international audience?
I mean, I never really thought of it that way. Like, I never really intended of making anything with some sort of impact. Like, obviously, if I had the ability and if I had like the
Mm-hmm.
opportunity to make something with an impact, I would definitely make it. But I never really thought of anything I make to have like a great impact. Um, then again, I'm Asian, so I am considered a POC. But I think groups of the favored, so whites, think of this because there are issues that they see within people who have experienced like racial issues, identity issues, like they're being judged for who they are. But for people who come from minority backgrounds, they just call it life because this is something that they deal with on a daily basis, something that they're used to. And I obviously think that this should be changed, and this is something that society should put like a greater force in changing. But looking at this at like a greater perspective, representation does matter. And again, like I wouldn't say my work impacted people, but it definitely leads me to a better understanding that these works are crucial in promoting like in a society and all that. But um as I was saying, like if we are POCs, then I think we have to put a greater force into actually making something that matters.
And
Right? Regardless like if I was to make something that's crucial in promoting like inclusion, then I would definitely speak of it from like my perspective or like a minority point of view without excluding like the other because the other represents me as well.
exactly. So and I like what you said there, but then you also make works for Nashe. You help him produce his DJing and all of that. So when you help him with his videos, you don't think about that minority perspective. What do you
No,
think?
I really don't. Like when I'm making videos for him, it's more of just like two creatives collaborating. It's more of not like it's not essentially like we're making something that is I don't know, like the message is important. Like
Mm-hmm.
we were to make something that I think would be crucial in like society, like when I'm talking about social issues such as race, identity, and all that, then yeah, I'd think of it. But then again, like me and him, it's just two creatives collaborating and just want to create.
I see. Very interesting. So, contrasting with your perspective, Kuwornu often uses historical and contemporary narratives to highlight social issues. How do you choose the stories you want to tell from the way that you make your own creative works and videos?
Uh, I would definitely say I choose stories I want to tell based on what I'm inspired to convey. So, like one example that I can give is one film that I made in high school titled Unhealthy Coping Mechanisms. It
Mm.
was I know I created this amidst like COVID. So we were literally stuck at home. But I mainly created this to advocate for those who suffer from mental health issues, especially in the Philippines where, like we see mental health as a taboo. We don't see it to be a real thing simply because we cannot like actually physically see it, but it does affect us like one way or another. Um, but then again, it's still so real. It's indeed very much happening. But if we don't address this, if we don't talk about this, then the issues will only rise because of these like conversations we refuse to have, and also because of the stigma so embedded in our society about mental health. Um, and another one is like I had my own share of mental issues. I was diagnosed with anxiety and I kind of had to learn to deal with that and all of that. And I would say like some of the ways I dealt with it was very much unhealthy. And we don't like to have these conversations because they're uncomfortable of having, but I think vulnerability is key. So these conversations are important in having, especially in our country that shies away from conversations like this. So you said Kuwornu uses historical and contemporary narratives. I think for me, I would definitely say historical in a sense because the stigma within mental health is still very much engraved in our culture, and that comes from history within itself.
Yeah,
um Asian culture in general. So yeah, I think what I'm inspired to tell, it's definitely like a shared experience, like experiences that I've had, and I'd be like, okay, maybe this is something worth telling.
let's see. Okay, thank you. So, shifting the conversation a little bit about representation in media, how do you see the representation of minorities in Italian media today, having lived there for 2 years?
That's actually such a cool question. I would definitely say in Italian media, they're shunned upon. Like you don't see a lot of conversation about them. And if you do see a conversation, it's definitely like there's a negative connotation. Um, so when I visited Escalino neighborhood, it's another place where a lot of the migrants go. So you'll see a lot of like Asian stores, you'll see a lot of like market vendors and all that. They live within their own bubble, so they don't go out of that bubble. Um, because simply because they just share the same experiences as those who also migrated to Italy. And in one of my classes, the class that I was talking about earlier called FYS, we kind of like came to this conclusion that we called this neighborhood a jail cell or a prison, only because like they do have their freedom, don't get me wrong, but society still doesn't accept them simply because they aren't Italian, regardless if they're like assimilated to the culture, they learn to speak the language, but because they weren't born in Italy, they are considered to not be Italian, hence why we call it like a jail or a prison, because they're confined to the spaces of that neighborhood and just remain there for the rest of their lives and like
Mm.
generational. um and then going off of that is again like when we're talking about Black Italians, they also face similar issues. And in one paper that I wrote, I quoted Michelle Nyonmo, I think that's her name. She states, I remember saying like she states something about like we are in a society and everything is imagined and imaged as we are all white or as all white. Maybe I'm getting that wrong, but along those lines. And then she also says Asian Italians, Black Italians are really struggling to be accepted as Italians. But they are Italian and they can also be Black, they can also be Asian, all of that. But again, like this is when topics of intersectionality goes to play because when you're talking about intersectionality in Italy, when you are considered to be Italian and another, then you are refused, like you were rejected, or you're not accepted by society. So I guess like to answer your question, they're definitely shunned upon. They can be both. I don't know, like they can still be a person while still being whole and obviously being accepted as Italian, but that does come with acceptance, self-awareness, especially when dealing with like certain type of like discrimination.
So, going back a little bit to Fred Kuwornu, he advocates for better representation of Black Italians in cinema. You're also a filmmaker. What are your thoughts on marginal representation as someone who's lived in Rome?
I would definitely answer this in a more general sense, like not in a filmmaker perspective, I guess. Only simply because I've never really seen any like Italian movies that deal with these issues, I guess. Like there are definitely Italian shows that I've watched that deal with like stereotypes and intersectionality. Like for example, I watched Scam Italia for one of my classes and I forgot her name. I think her name is Sarah. Maybe I'm wrong, but she is Muslim and she's also an Italian, and she kind of struggles like balancing that. Like she doesn't know if she's Muslim or Italian when she can be both, but certain factors in her life kind of draw her to each of the own rather than both. Like so there's no balance there. But like as I said earlier, like going back to like the Escalina neighborhood, the marginalized representation, like as a prison, as I said, like people stay within the same areas because they refuse to go elsewhere. This definitely goes back within like history and all that. I'm trying to remember it, but I can't right now. But the Escalina neighborhood is a visual representation of what segregation looks like. So like indeed, like the presence of the impact of these migrants, like they created something in diversified Rome, but like we as a class, like we kind of question like, but to what extent like the marginalized representation is there, because like it's represented but only within areas, because a lot of people refuse to accept them.
I see. Um, okay. So for my next question, I want to get more into about your creative side as a filmmaker. What specific changes do you hope to see in society as a result of your films?
uh I mean, hopefully if I pursue filming, then we can see a lot of progress in terms of like acceptance to be achieved, and when all opportunities are associated to all races and all identities rather than being favored based off the color of your skin. That is
Mhm.
definitely something like um I want to change, and like in the Philippines or in Asia, I guess, but more so in the Philippines, because I see it hand in hand. Like when I say the color of your skin, people who are white, they don't think of this because they are already favored as the majority. But when you're anything else but white, people will do anything to be in that group, to be favored as white. Like here in the Philippines, we have so many products that, and so many billboards are along the roads that promote skin whitening, because when you're white, that's associated to your social class, to the type of opportunities that you have, when it shouldn't be like that. So I hope like in the future with my films, like we change that. We change that through like accepting yourself, accepting the color of your skin, accepting your culture, like where you're from. Because a lot of people try to change that simply because of like the world we live in today,
Yeah.
favorite,
I think in the Philippines in particular, it's really kind of weird because like there's that idea that a lot of people subscribe to that people just want to be whiter and they don't really accept themselves. But I feel like not everyone really believes that. So it's just kind of like weird, like cultural thing that we have going on in our country.
Yeah, it's so prevalent too. It's so sad, honestly.
Yeah. Um, so in terms of Fred Kuwornu's films, his films have sparked conversations about citizenship and identity in Italy because in Italy, um, one of the things that makes someone Italian is their blood, and that
Yeah.
means you have to be white to be Italian. Um, what changes do you think are necessary for a more inclusive society in the Philippines and in Italy?
I think as a whole, like in general, to become like a more inclusive society is to be more accepting, or um and again, like in intercultural communications, one of my classes, our whole class revolved in self-awareness and the steps you need to take to become self-aware. um so accepting, definitely, because when you're accepting, you have the ability to be self-aware. And when you're talking about in an inclusive society, you're talking about the ability to accept those who are different from you.
Mhm.
So therefore, self-awareness is definitely key. It's being able to be like, you're different than me, but that doesn't make you any less. We're still very much equal. So self-awareness for sure.
Well, that those are all the questions I have for you right now, Shank. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.